Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5 tour of Cranbrook's art and architecture. I am your host, curator Kevin Adkisson, and today I am coming to you live from the middle of Lone Pine Road, or the middle of Academy Way, and we are going to be talking about the Lone Pine Road gates, which are currently actively being restored by James Viste, who is a graduate of Cranbrook Academy of Art and a former student of Gary Griffin, who was the designer of the gates. So today will be our first Live at 5 with someone other than me doing the talking. But before we get down to the craftsmen at work at the gate, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Gary Griffin. Gary Griffin taught here at Cranbrook. He was the artist-in-residence from 1984 until 2006. And he designed these gates at the end of Academy Way between 1996 and their installation in the year 2000. So as we look down the road towards the gates, they will come more clearly into view. Part of their design is that they shift from being almost like an architectural line drawing into a much more three-dimensional gate towards the end of the street. Now, Gary Griffin was born in 1945 in Wichita Falls, Texas. His mother was an interior designer, and his grandmother was also in the arts. And so he was deeply influenced by art and design from a young age. His father was a rancher and died when he was young. Both Gary and his father were young. And the family moved out to California, which is where his mother ran an antique shop on the Pacific Coast Highway and where she sold things like Jack Leonard Larson velvets. He went on to study he earned his BA at Cal State University, Long Beach. And then he went on to study at the Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, where he studied metalsmithing. After he graduated in Philadelphia, he taught for 10 years at the Rochester Institute of Technology in Rochester, New York. And it was about 10 years on that he and his wife began thinking, okay, what's next in my practice? Rochester was a school of handicraft within a technical university. And Gary Griffin was beginning to feel limited with his sort of metal being mostly done in sculptural forms and in brooches. And so he was looking for what was the next aspect for his career. He heard that the Cranbrook position was opening. He knew about Cranbrook. He talks about that most of his teachers at Cal State Long Beach and at Tyler School of Art had been Cranbrook alumni. And so he decided to apply to Cranbrook, and he took the application very seriously. He worked on it for months. He submitted it. He was invited for an interview here at Cranbrook by Roy Slade, who was the president of the Academy at that time. And Roy Slade, they hit it off, and Roy said, oh, well, if you're going back to New York, you need to go over to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because our hit exhibit, Design in America, will be opening soon, and you'll want to see that. And so Gary Griffin, he describes heading back to New York thinking, I've got this job. He finds out he did get the job, and then he gets out of the subway, he walks up to the Met, and at the center of the Met door is this banner hanging down that says, Design in America, the Cranbrook Vision. And he says that he just realized, oh my gosh, what have I gotten into? And he shows up to teach here that next fall, and his colleagues are people like Daniel Libeskind in the architecture department and Gerhard Nodell and all of these real nationally and internationally known leaders. And he realizes that he's no longer at a technical institute. He's no longer even in a department. He's a one-man metalsmithing machine. And so he does really the metalsmithing department blossoms under his leadership, and he was interested in having students that came from jewelry backgrounds, but also from architectural backgrounds and from furniture, and letting students explore anything related to metal. At the same time that he was teaching here from 1984 to 2006, Gary also was running Griffin Metalwork, which was his studio where he worked on commissions, including the gate here. And he would work on these projects, and he would usually have 1, 2, or 3 students in the summer who would stay on to work for Griffin Metalworks. And then during the year, he would have students and alumni who also helped him out. He would spend about 2 or 3 days working on professional practice and 3 or 4 days working with the students. And of course, he and his family lived here on Academy Way. After Gary Griffin retired in 2006, he and his family moved to El Rito, New Mexico, which is where his grandmother had lived at the Taos Artist Colony, and he used to take the train as young as 9 from Los Angeles to Taos, and he is still practicing in New Mexico after making a career of sort of sculpture, utilitarian works, gates, and designs. Now he's working mostly in sculpture, but he is still practicing. I wish Gary Griffin was here for the conversation, but we have the next best thing, which is a former student of Gary's, James Viste, who is class of 1997 from the metalsmithing department. Welcome to Live at 5.
It's nice to be back here.
Yeah.
Nice to be revisiting the gates. Unfortunately, they had suffered a traffic injury and needed some repairs, and on top of it, the standard wears of corrosion in time have reached the need for a lot of corrosion removal and paint restoration. So the two culminated in a job working on the gates 25 years after they were designed and 20 years after they were installed.
Yeah. And did you work on the gates initially?
I worked, actually my very first job for Gary when I first started working for him was soldering together the model for this one. So I got to see it and hold it up in that window right over there in that space and kind of envision what it would look like, and then worked with him throughout the process. His final fabrication of the big gate was done at a facility downtown Detroit that I used to have a shop in. So I've got to see the little ones and the big one all kind of come together with a lot of fellow students and fellow alumni through the entire process, the 5 years that it took.
And what was it like to work for Gary?
Working for Gary was the experience of a lifetime. It was one of the best trainings I ever had. He really taught me how to take the skills that I learned from others, combine them all, and then really make them my own. You know, he was really one to individualize the students and make them understand who they were outside of what they learned from others.
And were you a metalsmith before you came to Cranbrook?
I did come to Cranbrook as a metalsmith, mostly making blades and some small architectural things, and have moved on. Still make blades, still do architectural things, a little bit of sculpture, but mainly try to stick with, I like function. I like things that people are going to use and enjoy for a long time, maybe even generations.
Yeah. What is a lesson that Gary imparted on you?
I would say the thing that most stands out about Gary to me was his avid interest in precision. Not just in precision in how you make, but precision in what you make, and very much precision in how you talk about what you make. He was very well-rounded. He liked to have a well-rounded studio and understood all aspects of art, but precision was a very important thing in the department all the time.
Yeah, and I think I got that reading about him on his Smithsonian
Very
artist
much so,
page,
yes.
that he was so interested in much more than just technical metal. He was interested in the liberal arts.
Taking the vocational art skills and bringing them up to another level, which is, I think, just as direly important today as it was then.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now?
Well, this gate...
let's get closer to it.
This gate was hit by an incoming car that at night that didn't know it was hit. So this piece here was stretched and bent. So I built a truss and I used the hydraulic jack to push it back to straight again.
Yeah.
In the process, the latch that goes across here was bent, and the pin that mounts it was broken, which I'm stubbornly trying to drill out right now. It's been corroded in there for a few years, and then put that back in. Then all surfaces get pinholes, they get chips from people climbing over the gates like they're not supposed to and things like that. And so you have to, that starts to rust, so you have to abrade that. In this case, on-site abrasion using abrasives, sanding discs, things like that. Not changing the nature of the gate, just removing the oxidation so you can put a new coat of finish on and get another 20 years out of it. So everywhere you see gray, there was some kind of an injury or just the passage of time, and corrosion occurs in pretty much all metals. And tomorrow we'll sand this all down and start top coating the whole thing in a new coat of black, and it'll look, hopefully, I'm confident, just like it did when it was brand new.
Yeah. What are the materials that he used?
This is all steel. The only thing not straight steel here is actually the pillars inside this column were trusses made of steel, and then they were galvanized. And then the bolts you see there, he put in stainless so that in the long term, if it ever has to be removed, they won't be corroded and they can be easily removed. Very thought-filled about the longevity and how to help the future maintain and conserve the work.
Yeah. Someone asked, are you using Bondo? But I think you're just sanding.
This is actually an epoxy primer. It's the Tynamic brand paint that he used.
Okay.
So wherever I have removed material down to bare metal, I'm going with the original primer that was on this, which is a 2-part epoxy. And then that will be smoothed out with sandpaper, and then the top coat is a polyurethane, UV resistant of the same company. And it's the match of the color of the original. This is quite faded. It'll be a semi-gloss, pretty dark black.
Yeah, so when we were trying to match the color a few weeks ago, we were trying to match to this sun faded, and even though it's a metal paint, it was difficult to match. But the best thing of a living artist is that Gary was able to tell us the color. So James, why don't you show us, do you have any of your tools out, or did you put them all away?
I'm pretty much finishing up for today, so I'm actually just using one little grinder and a drill, and not the most special grinder in the world, just to remove a little material while I get this pin driven out of this part.
Yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think the gates pretty much speak for Cranbrook and themselves.
Yeah.
And just a joy to have been part of, among many students who worked on this along with Gary.
Yeah. And I know that you've also done a few other projects for Cranbrook.
I've been a subcontractor to a sculpture conserver here in Detroit for many years. So I worked on the original Oscar Bach Boys School gates when they were restored in 2000, and then when the courtyard was restored in 2010, I think.
Thereabouts, yeah.
And then the River Road railing, which is over the Rouge River over by Kingswood, that one was completely rotted. I pretty much made it, and that was a very early Nichols fabrication, so it was interesting to fabricate in the same style of somebody who was fabricating in the late teens, early 20s. Very different than the way you would actually weld things together today. Very different from the way Gary would weld things together. So yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition of the transition in time in the technology of simply welding.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and it's a nice, warm, sunny day, and no better place to be anywhere right now.
I agree. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the gate. One thing that Gary Griffin talked about when he was given this commission was that he worked at a place, Cranbrook, where our gates are often known by their name of the metalsmith, and how unusual it is that we refer to our gates with terms like Nichols Gate, after Walter Nichols, who made the gate, or Yellen Gate, which is Samuel Yellen's. And Gary Griffin recognized how that was really a tribute to how Cranbrook views the craftsman and how Cranbrook views the maker of these pieces. And so today we do call these the Griffin Gates. Oddly enough, we don't call Bill Massey's gates the Massey Gates, but maybe we can get that started. And so I want to end our Live at 5 here just with a closer look at the design of the gates. Now, if you go online and go to the American Craft Council, you'll see lots of Gary Griffin's other designs, or just Google image them. And they're often very naturalistic. And this one is very different. And that is a direct result of the initial designs of the gate. Dr. Lillian Bowder, Cranbrook's president and CEO, she saw the designs, and this is a story that James told me yesterday, and Dr. Bowder said, "Gary, this is a Gary Griffin gate for Cranbrook. I need a Cranbrook gate by Gary Griffin." And so this is actually rather unusual from the sort of total works of Gary Griffin. And he describes it as being sort of having different readings depending on how far away or how close you see it. So when we were looking at it from the middle of the street and looking down, it looked almost like a line drawing, almost like a perspective drawing. But then as you get closer to it, the sort of transparency, it begins to become thicker, and you begin to understand this 6-inch thickness. And it is a very thick gate, because it's made up of these 3 different layers that are welded together. And you begin to understand it almost as a globe, was one of the readings that Gary Griffin mentioned. He also thought that it was evocative of a web or a briar patch. And one thing I learned yesterday is that these designs, these little divots, which are all unique, are actually rubbings from tires that were here in the parking lot. And so Gary and his student came out and they rubbed people's tires and they got the pattern, and then they went into the metalsmithing shops, which at the time these gates were made were located in the arts and crafts court, and these little divots come from the tires. Now, my favorite aspect of the gate is how it lines up with a little bit of distance. There are still cones behind me. I'm not standing in Lone Pine Road. But do you see how Gary frames this view down Academy Way? And if we could see through the trees, if we could see all the way to the end of the street, there are 2 stone pillars by Eliel Saarinen. And those stone pillars by Eliel are the same proportion as these views looking down. Now, the last feature that I'll talk about in the gate is the hinge. And this hinge is very interesting because Gary described it as this is never the hinge that an iron worker would have made. An iron worker would have sort of done a pin, done a lock. The gate is secured. That is the most efficient use of metal. What Gary wanted to use was what he called a teapot hinge, or a silversmith's hinge. And he created this teapot hinge by using these trapezoids. And he described it as this sort of marriage of the almost line drawing of the steel to then the stone pillars. And the stone pillars are part of Eliel Saarinen's design for the campus. They date back to the 1930s. And so he wanted to carefully mediate between the line drawing of the gate to then the power of the limestone, Indiana limestone columns. And of course, the gate is in 3 sections. So there are also the pedestrian gates, which until COVID-19, I had never seen locked. What's interesting, as you look at the gate, you'll see that they're entirely asymmetrical. So he never deploys an actual symmetrical line on the piece. And he talked about with Glenn Adamson, the noted craft curator, he told Adamson, when he was designing this gate, he was not focused as much on the lines themselves, but on the negative space they create. And so he modulated quite carefully using the different maquettes and models how these negative spaces would be read. And he wanted it to be different closed or open and be different depending on what kind of light or what season or perhaps even what mood you are seeing the gate in. And you'll also notice that it gets more dense towards the end. As you have seen, as we've been conducting our Live at 5, 2 cars have turned down and realized the gates are closed. That is my chief critique with the piece, is that the line drawing of metal is beautiful, but you cannot see it from the other end of the road. But we sacrifice for the art. James, did you have anything else you wanted to add before I conclude?
When they come down, they do get up close enough to enjoy it.
I like that. So when the cars turn down, they get close enough to enjoy it.
They don't enjoy backing up and turning around, but sometimes when I'm working, I open it up for them and let them out.
That's very kind. And I did successfully stop some people who were fighting to put reflective tape on the gate, because we would not put reflective tape on a Yellen gate. We will not do it on the Griffin gate. Thanks so much for joining me for another Live at 5 tour. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into these lovely gates here at the intersection of Academy Way and Lone Pine Road. I'm Kevin Atkinson, the curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. Live at 5 tours are every Tuesday and Thursday here on Instagram and every Wednesday on Facebook. We'll be back next Tuesday with another Live at 5 tour. Enjoy the beautiful weather. Wear your mask. Be safe, everyone. And send me a message if you have more questions or if you have any requests for a future Live at 5 tour. If you want to see photographs of Gary Griffin working or models of the earlier designs of the gate, head to Cranbrook Center's website, center.cranbrook.edu, and look at our digital image database, and you'll see lots of photos of this gate design. Thanks so much for joining me. Have a wonderful weekend.